we're really interested in watching the recordings even, so I am excited to have you share with us.
Okay, awesome. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. And oops, let me do. We're all
Well,
Zoom
make me a
experts now.
co-host.
Oh yeah, I need to be a host if that's all right.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay. Make Basil a co-host too.
Okay, now I can do it. Let's. Can everyone see my screen? Good. Awesome. Cool. So I'll jump in. Yeah. So really excited to be here. I appreciate you for putting this on. I am going to talk about recruiting in the age of COVID. My company's in a position where we have a ton of data on this, and we look at it all the time. And we noticed there were some interesting trends, and found out that other people might be interested in it too. So put this together. I hope it's interesting. I'm happy to answer any questions. Presentation will probably take around 25 or so minutes. So, and then we can do questions or discussion after that. But feel free to cut me off if anything comes up while we're doing that. And so I'll start off kind of very simple agenda, starting off telling you what user interviews is so you know where this data is coming from, with its limitations and why it's good and why it's bad. I think that's always important when you're sharing data. And then we are a two-sided marketplace. So we have researchers on one side, participants on the other. So explaining how different groups have changed their activity. Did you raise your hand, Ella?
Yes, yeah. Yes. I look, analog hand, not the virtual one. Analog. It works. Look, wow.
It works.
So my analog hand said, you also promised, and I told people that you might actually show us a demo of your new product, because that was one of the other draws.
Cool.
So
I'll do that also. So I'll do that at the end.
We'll have the discussion, and then maybe after the Q&A, we can have the demo. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. Always happy to give demos. Cool. And you actually mentioned before this, just to go off script a little bit, how actually I'll tell you what the product does, then I can do a little tangent into how we came up with the idea after that. So cool. So user interviews. So we focus on the participant management layer of user research. So as everyone is familiar, in this group at least, one of the primary pain points for doing user research has always been finding the right user. And the big split there is always if you want to go talk to prospective or non-users, or if you want to talk to existing users that you have. And we have products for both of those. So that's the first decision you make when you use user interviews. That's the first fork in the road. So if you want to talk to non-users or prospective users, we have an audience of participants, a few 100,000 people, primarily in the US and Canada right now, but starting to move into other countries. And we have a ton of data on them. And then we have a set of automations that gets the right person in the right study. So all that manual stuff that I'm sure you've all done tens of hours with. So screener survey, qualification based off that, the mail merge, the scheduling, the payments, the reminders, all of that is tied to that audience. And our real differentiator there is we use data pretty intelligently to make sure we send the right screener to the right people. So we can screen fully professional testers. We can make sure we find people faster. We usually find people in under 2 hours. We can find pretty niche audiences. The second product, if you want to talk to existing users, that product is newer. So for that product, there's a few different value props. The first is you can just upload a list of users. We then have a set of automations that, once again, gets the right user in the right study. So that same mail merge, scheduling, payments, reminders, screener survey, all of that. On the back end, there's a different value prop, which is basically a CRM for user research. So we think it's the first CRM for user research that lets you track everyone you've reached out to, how much you've paid each participant, everyone who's participated, make sure you're not pinging them too much. A lot of the stuff you may have been organizing on a Google Sheet beforehand. And then a way for you to build up that audience through opt-in forms. So I'll do a demo of that at the end, but just to get the layout of where we're coming from with this data, those are the two products we do. So we're completely tool agnostic. It's very horizontal. It can be used for any type of user research. And with that, we work with a bunch of companies. So one bias is probably we're a little bit skewed towards tech companies, so your Atlassian, Spotify's of the world. We do have retail companies like Home Depot, Walmart, financial institutions, and obviously we like to put the sexier logos up front, but we do work with companies of all sizes in a bunch of different industries. So with that, just to kind of summarize once again the benefits and positives of the data. There's a lot of good data. So it's existing users and non-users, which we can segment. Historically, in-person and remote. Obviously, we haven't been doing in-person the past couple months. We can look at all parts of the funnel. So the participant application rate, just to begin with, how incentives affect research, no-show rate, people scheduling, different types of research. So once again, we're tool agnostic, research agnostic, so both moderated and unmoderated. And then the feedback and quality of the participants over this time period. And then limitations are we are primarily US and Canada. We're doing like beta launches in Australia and a bunch of other countries, but the majority of our data is from US and Canada. And then of course, especially with that first product, Recruit, like these are people that opted into our audience, right? So if you just happen to go like knock on doors down the street, it's probably not going to match these absolute numbers. But I do think the directions and trends, even with that audience, especially over this time period, the trends we see, I presume they would match even groups of people who hadn't opted in. But the absolute numbers might be a little bit different when looking at that. So that's where we're coming from. Any questions about that, or should I just jump into the data? All right. So let's start with the researcher side of the audience. So I've kind of made this little framework during COVID of different types of research teams. So I'm very bad at naming things. I named my company User Interviews. I'm not good at this. But the names we came with were quick iterations, long iterations, and strategic. So your quick iteration companies are companies who are able to make quick product iterations. They tend to be software companies. And what I kind of define as the line between quick and long is they expected to be able to make a product iteration before the effects of COVID passed. So if they think in their mind, so they think, hey, we're going to be in quarantine for 3 months, we expect that we can iterate our product within that 3-month timeline. So some examples of this would be Google like iterated on the way they present Google Meet, contactless delivery, a bunch of event companies have started building out things for virtual events. So these were, once again, primarily software companies that were able to make pretty quick iterations on their product. Long iteration companies tend to be products that it just takes longer to build. They're not worse product teams by any means, but their products just, it's not a code. Sometimes you need to actually manufacture something. So they tended to decrease research because for them, they said, hey, the research we do now is actually not going to be as relevant by the time the product comes out. So we don't want to like spend time on this research. So one of our clients is a toilet paper manufacturer, and they called us up and we're like, hey, we're actually going to cancel our subscription for the next few months. And we're like, well, that sucks, but why? Like, Hilton canceled their subscription. We kind of understood that because they were, obviously getting hit by travel bans and everything. But we were like, aren't you like selling a bunch of toilet paper now? Isn't this like a perfect time to invest? And they told us yes, but by the time we manufacture more toilet paper, we don't know what the world's going to be like. So we don't want to do research now that we won't be able to use by the time it takes to manufacture that. So that's what I call the long iteration companies. The third group are the ones that aren't really thinking in terms of this specific product cycle, but are doing more generative long-term research, more strategic research. And a bunch of those companies, and even like investors, they are using this as a way to see a lens into the future. So they think that this time period has really accelerated trends that they thought were happening, or if not accelerated, for this time period, are showing trends that they think will happen in 5 years full time. So this is their turn to say like, hey, we think remote work's going to be 50% of work by 2025 or whatever your percents are. Right now, everyone's doing it. So this is a perfect time to go see what the pain points are so that we can start building that and investing against that for when we think, after this, when the trend starts moving that direction for the long term. So we've seen a lot of interesting research around that too. So those are the 3 big buckets. There's obviously a ton of different vectors here, obviously how much your industry's been affected and other things, but just one thing I noticed. Now let's actually jump into the data. Okay, so first thing is in-person projects went to 0. They used to be about 25, 30%. They're not happening anymore. This should not be surprising. What you saw at first was there was like kind of this drop at the beginning of March. I'm sure everyone kind of remembers March, like each week was a very distinct thing. So it was a little drop, and then it was like, okay, it's going to half. And then this week is where we said, okay, we're actually not going to allow people to do in person anymore. So this should be intuitive, not surprising to everyone. But when I actually look at the data, it makes me remember how like in March, each week was a very distinct feeling about how we were going to respond to this. And then we actually were curious how this one popped up and found that it was a client in New Zealand who did a project with their own users, and they thought where they were was safe. So one client. So what you see with this drop, though, what is more interesting is that most clients have been able to move that in-person research to remote research. So what you're seeing here with the colors is blue is in-person, yellow and green are either online or over the phone. So initially you see this cut down, right? So slowly like in-person's getting smaller and smaller, remote staying constant. But then you start seeing this build up as companies and researchers figured out how to do research remote that they used to do in person. Even companies that we expected, there's always been some companies that do in person that is pretty clear they could do it remote, but then there were some that we understood why they did it in person because there was like a physical product and it was hard to do remote. But I think for most researchers, it is their job, so they have to find a way to do it. So we were really impressed how that whole segment was able to move over to in person in just a couple of weeks and still do research. The next thing is looking at unmoderated versus moderated. So historically, unmoderated studies, and once again, this is with our audience, so I'm not saying that unmoderated is 10% of research always, but just within our users, unmoderated studies were about 10%. And that's what we saw kind of leading up to the crisis. The first 4 weeks that when everyone was really changing their life and figuring out how to work from home and figuring out what was happening, that almost doubled as a percent of projects. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And, the theories we have talking to researchers is just that, researchers are people. And during these 4 weeks, people were going home. They didn't know what was happening. Their schedules were in flux. Their kids were, not going to school anymore. And they still needed to do research, but unmoderated allowed an extra level of flexibility. So they were just able to say like, okay, I'm just going to do an unmoderated study now. I'll do my moderated ones next month and double up then. And that's a way for me to do this in a more flexible way where I don't need to worry about my schedule when I still don't know what my schedule is. So we definitely saw that effect. Talking to other people who did unmoderated also, they said, we just wanted to get as much data as possible. Like we had no idea what our users were thinking. So we just wanted to send out as much stuff and just get a faster response rate. So it wasn't just our schedules. It was, we just need to collect data because right now this is, the biggest displacement in consumer preferences that we've probably seen. Over the next 4 weeks, it kind of met somewhere in the middle. So we're still seeing some of those trends, not as sharp as it was. Our expectation and some of the leading indicators are showing that it's going to settle back around the 10% in this month. All right. The next thing is looking at, talking to existing users from our panel. Once again, so what you're looking at with this chart is the green is users from the user interviews panel. The blue is users, like existing users from the clients. And obviously, it's not usually a 10 to 90% in the world. Our product's newer. But the trend, I think, is interesting and is real. And what we saw is that, and what we're seeing is that people are doing more and more research with their existing users. And when we do our meta user research, when we're doing user research with user researchers about how they do user interviews for user research, what they tell us is that in this time, there was like a lot of fear, obviously, and we wanted to take care of our own. So we wanted to make sure that we're not so worried about going and acquiring new users now. We need to make sure we don't lose our existing users. And I often think of this split as an acquisition versus churn split. So when you're doing research and the goal is acquisition, you want to go talk to prospective non-users. But when you're worried about investing in churn, you want to talk to existing users. And this shows that everyone started looking inwards very strongly. And that was a really big trend. And that's also what our qualitative research said when we talked to our own users. So I thought that was interesting. And we did the same thing. Obviously, we were like, okay, everything's going towards existing users. Let's make sure they don't churn. And then we'll go figure out how to acquire new users. One thing that is, I think, a little bit sad is there has been a decrease in research from smaller companies. So just doing a very basic split, like under 50 people in the company versus over 50 people in the company. We've historically had about a 30%, 70% split in our use case. And what we found is that the companies under 50 people really cut down their research. They obviously have smaller budgets and, are just smaller companies by definition. So when they got scared, this was, for those companies, more of a nice to have than a need to have. And they cut down research, whereas the bigger companies were able to maintain their research cadence, which once again just speaks to their budgets and the flexibility they have there. I think this is sad. Obviously, I think one thing that, I got into user research from the startup perspective where I was starting a company and we didn't talk to anybody. So I think it's super important for these small companies to talk to users. Hopefully we're running some deals to try to get it so that's a little bit cheaper for them over the next quarter. But this is what we're seeing in the data. And then with the researcher side, what hasn't changed yet is the B2B versus B2C distribution. So we talk with both B2B companies and B2C companies, and that distribution has stayed almost exactly the same. So we haven't seen any difference, Atlassian versus Spotify, for instance. The second thing that hasn't changed is the project size, which was surprising to me. I thought that some researchers with budget constraints would say, hey, we're gonna, instead of talking to 8 people, we'll talk to 5 people and still get, call it 70, 80% of the benefit, but really cut down on that cost. We did not see that. The average project size stayed the same. And that was even, controlling for unmoderated versus moderated studies. And then another thing with our product is we don't choose the incentive, the researcher does. So it's a bit of a marketplace in that perspective. And we kind of assume that, just supply and demand, that the price point for incentives would decrease. That is not the case. The incentives, researchers have kept incentives pretty much the same no matter how we cut it. Although, as I'll show you in the next section, participants are responding a little bit different to the incentives, but researchers have kept it basically the same. Any questions about that data, or save them to the end? All right, we'll jump into the other side of our market. So that is participant activity. All right, so basically what you're seeing here is classic like Econ 101, supply and demand. There's a lot of people who are looking for side income, and a lot of people have a lot more time. And obviously as a participant doing a user research session, the cost is your time and the benefit is extra money. So what we're seeing is participants are way more active than they'd ever been before. So the growth between kind of February and May was almost 50% in participant activity. And when you go back to this researcher slide, the number of projects increased a little bit, maybe 10%. So on the researcher side, it only increased 10%, but the participants increased over 50%. So this is just number of active participants. And a really interesting thing with that is it's not necessarily new participants. It's participants that had used us, call it 6 months ago, 5 months ago, and then didn't do the next couple months. They started coming back. So when you look at April, for instance, which was the first month that was fully in this zone, we had a ton of users who we had counted, or participants who we had counted as churn, come back. So these are people that we know we're really controlling for that person and that they are changing their preferences. And they used to say, hey, it's not really worth it. I knew what it was. I tried it out. I'm not going to do any more user interviews. To now hey, this month, maybe I'll try it out again, or maybe I'll go give it another shot, which was pretty surprising for us. With that, though, as you would expect, qualification rate declined. So we see, we have a pretty good qualification rate. We use Data Pretty Smart to send people the right screener. But it seems like people are filling out screeners that they're unlikely to qualify for, or we have a few different avenues where you can fill out screener surveys. They're not taking the ones we recommend they take. They're taking extra ones in addition to that. So these same participants that are reactivated are also doing more research. So qualification rate declined, which once again, really lines up with the basic supply and demand story. On the good side, they haven't been bad participants. There hasn't been an increase in fraud. It hasn't been an increase in bad participants. It's actually weirdly stable over the past 4 months. So every study, we have a feedback rating, like similar to Uber. And to the point that I went and looked into the equations to make sure that all of our graphs were not pulling in false data or something, but it's been the exact same bad feedback percentage for the past 4 months, which was kind of odd, but a good sign for us. And then no-shows. So the no-show story kind of matches that story I talked about, researchers with unmoderated. So historically, we have about a 10% no-show rate, so 90% show, obviously. In March, that almost doubled, and people just did not show up for studies. And it really matches the story. March was such a disruptive month for people that going to a research session they might have signed up for 4 days before became a pretty low priority when you find out that your child's not going to go to school anymore, right? Or you're not at the office anymore, or hey, I don't want to go to an in-person study. So we saw that double, which was pretty scary for us internally. But then in April, it just kind of smoothed out, went back to 10%, May was 9%. So it seems like that was not a change in how people act when they're working from home or under lockdown. It was just a transaction cost, right? A transition cost as people changed their behavior. They became a little flakier. And then, the final one I want to show here is how people look at incentives. So incentives is always a little bit tricky to look at because obviously the time of the study matters, like how long it is. And then also people tend to researchers tend to do higher incentives when a study is more difficult. So when it's hey, I know I'm trying to find a niche audience, we know we probably need to pay a little bit more. So what we actually saw was something that was on the face historically almost backwards, which is that as incentive increased, the fill rate for those studies decreased a little bit. When we control for length of, we have a lot of controls that are hard to show in a just X and Y axis here, but when we control for them, it makes sense because there's more difficult studies. But after COVID, what we found is even without controlling for those, just looking at the exact same graph, it's flipped. So now, even though people are paying more for more hard studies, those now do have a higher fill rate. So we're finding that participants are more elastic. So the incentive amount is having a bigger effect and is bringing in harder to find people generally. So participants are more, once again, elastic and more responsive to increases in incentive. So they're a stronger motivator, which once again just follows that basic kind of supply and demand story of participants have more time on their hands, and obviously unemployment has spiked and people are just looking for other types of income across the board. Cool. So that's pretty much all the data I've got. Happy to send you guys any follow-up data, or if you have any other questions around that, happy to talk through that. I think that took the 20 to 25 minutes, but happy to jump into a demo also if you want to do that, or if you want to once again do any Q&A, I'm happy to answer that right now also.
Hi, just a quick question. Thank you for your talk. It's been really interesting and speaks to a lot of the challenges I'm having right now. My name's Deborah. I'm working on a project with very niche users, and it's been a challenge to find even our own customers during COVID because people are busier than usual because they're struggling to juggle all the things without all the help they usually have. or, are teaching their kids while they're at home, also working. So I'm wondering about your panel. How many niche users do you tend to have in terms of, let's say, high net worth or, hard to find customers?
Yeah, we have a lot. There's obviously things we can't find, but just maybe some examples of pretty difficult ones that we find pretty regularly. People ask for doctors all the time, so we recently found 40 oncologists for a client. On the other B2B side, I mentioned Atlassian a couple of times, so we're constantly finding software engineers or product managers that use Jira for them, or don't use Jira for them. So we have a ton in that category. With high net worth, once you get around kind of the over 500K a year, it gets pretty hard for us. Like, they don't tend to sign up for things like this, but getting up to around like the 200, 250K, we have pretty representative amount of that. So we're able to find people in those categories pretty easy. But if you're looking for, like, for instance, with car studies, we can find BMW and Mercedes owners. We can't really find a lot of Ferrari and Lamborghini owners as one proxy.
Thanks. That's helpful.
Did that answer your question? Want to make sure.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Basil. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is Peter McNally from the Bentley University User Experience Center out in Massachusetts in the US. So I'm used to using a lot of recruiters, especially for like tough recruits. So like one example would be like software developers who like have like specialists, development languages, things like that. And a lot of it is, really understanding where they're coming from. And you mentioned your value prep is automation. So how much of this is like machine learning and versus like actually talking to folks? So what would you do to convince me to use your service versus going to like a traditional recruiter first?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So one is just like the process of interacting. So we productize the service in a lot of ways, right? So with a traditional recruiter, you probably send a Word doc, they send you back a quote like a week later, and then eventually they'll send you back an Excel. All our pricing and everything's transparent. It's all self-serve, very much a product. But in this business, studies pay pretty well, right? Like it's kind of fun. So there's real value there for the end user. It's not like mechanical Turk. There's more value for your end user here usually. So acquisition is not the differentiator in this business. What happens though is that basically if someone fills out 4.8 screener surveys and doesn't get selected, they tend to churn. So what makes our audience better than other audiences is we are better at using the data. So we send the screener to the person before they kind of hit that 4.8. So then our audience is more active and we're able to get more niche users. So and we're able to limit how many they do also because we know, we have a greater confidence in if they're going to get selected or not. So like the way we do that, the example I usually use, I've probably already said this to someone in this group before, but is that like Spotify's a client, one of their 20 screener questions will be what streaming service do you use, right? Pandora is also a client of ours. They might say, hey, we want to talk to Apple Music users this week. So now we already know, hey, these people told us they don't use Apple Music. Let's not send it to them. These people told us they do use Apple Music, so let's send it to them. And obviously we do that at scale with like thousands of sessions a week. And that makes our audience smarter over time. So when you look at our match rate over time, I showed it was, it dropped to 45%. But if you go talk to one of these recruiting companies, right, they'll tell you they have like 5 million people or something like that. And it's going to be much lower because they're pretty much doing phone calls down huge list as their primary method. So that's usually our differentiator, or that's how I believe our differentiator is. So it allows us to do it cheaper and faster, primarily.
All right, cool. Thanks. And I'm sure you have more info on your website if you want to take a look.
Yeah, and I'll do a demo after this if you guys want.
When I compared, I talked to him and I compared the prices of what they were charging for what we were getting was like half. So that's a good.
Yeah, sounds good to me. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I can jump in and do a demo if that
Dan,
would be
do you have a
interesting, but I
question?
don't want to force you all to look at a demo if you don't think that would be interesting.
Dan, did you have a question?
I do have a quick
Oh, you
question.
have a question.
Sorry, I was on
Awesome.
mute. This is Ken. And you mentioned that you're finding that users or participants are elastic. And I was hoping you could elaborate that on a little bit more. Like, I think you were saying the incentives are higher and they're being more successful in bringing people in, so you're seeing a higher fill rate. But can you tell us a little bit more about what that means to be elastic and what you're seeing in human behavior that shows that?
Yeah, once again, this is kind of hard to show on just like an X and Y axis because studies are different, right? So just doing incentive versus fill rate doesn't take into nuances if it's in-person versus remote, if it's 30 minutes versus an hour, if it's a student versus a doctor. So it was hard to show the right graph. But in general, what we're seeing is that when you look at similar companies, depending on how we cut it based on different variables, the fill rate increases more based on incentive increase than it would have 4 months ago. Obviously, that's always been a factor that increases fill rate, but it has generally actually tended to be more of a like minimum. Like once you get past this point, it's not going to make that much of a difference unless you start getting crazy with incentives. Now what we're saying is, you know, it actually is more of like a smooth line up and to the right. Did that make sense? That was kind of a convoluted answer. I want to make sure that answered it correctly. But basically what we're saying is that when you look at like you add $10 for this comparable study, the comparable study with like the $10 more is now like going to have a higher fill rate, more responses in a way it didn't used to 4 months ago. Cool. Any other questions or any follow-ups on that question?
The bad participants, who determines the, you get feedback from the researchers or a number of rejects, or how do you get to 2%?
Yeah, so we have a few. That one that I showed is basically after a participant has finished the study, there's basically, we actually use smiley faces. So there's like a smiley face, a medium face, and a frowny face. And it's only 2% got the frowny face, which is another, once again, we do a lot of data to make sure if anyone ever no-shows, we put them on this do not recruit list. If anyone gets a bad review, we put them on the do not recruit list. If people have multiple accounts from the same IP, we do a lot of stuff to make the quality increase by having this pretty massive do not recruit list.
Dan, you had a question, I'm sorry.
Okay, and actually it moves a tiny bit away from the recruitment to the actual research. So I don't know if you can answer this, but depending on how much contact you've had with the researchers in this time period, I was curious after seeing that graph where in-person research has gone to zero, if you've come across any creative ways that researchers have adapted, you know, if you can't do it in person, that they've adapted methods to the online space that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, so, you know, it obviously depends what type of research and what the product is. So like the most obvious one, just to start with the obvious, is people doing like Zoom calls instead of one-on-one face-to-face studies. I'm trying to think if there's been anything particularly interesting. I think there has been an uptick in people looking at remote testing tools. So we see people asking us like, hey, who do you recommend? Like, what do you think about Look Back? What do you think about these? So which you would expect. And then we've seen a couple cases of people mailing like a physical product. So being like, okay, we're going to like mail you this, do a diary study at home instead of just giving us the feedback there. Nothing like, or at least not saying it's not happening, but from our position, I haven't seen anything like that wowed me. Or it was like, oh, that's really cool. Like that was not intuitive.
Like a contextual study where like they walk around the room with their like camera showing.
I have, it might have happened. I don't actually like look at all the details. We're like so focused on just getting them to commit and those thousands, but none of that came across me, but it might be happening and I just missed it.
Thanks.
Have you done any?
No, I haven't had a chance yet.
Cool.
I've been doing a lot of pictures to my trades recently, unfortunately. My house falling apart. The plumber, the electrician, there's all these pictures.
That's funny. Thumbtack to build something with that.
Not to mention all the snakes I've been filming in my front lawn today. All the people putting things down my sewer. It's very interesting, the technology in that space, but no, it's not a really proper research study.
It counts.
Yeah. So if there's no more questions, we get to demo.
All right, let's do it. Give me 1 minute to kind of pull that up.
Okay, great. I told you we'd have interesting people and with interesting questions. I'm glad you could do this. Thank you so
That's
much.
good. Yeah, no, I love.
That was super interesting to see the sort of those numbers. Support.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they change. I think it's interesting to see what happened. For me personally, I'm very interested to see like if any of these stick, right? I'm assuming a lot of them will kind of revert back to the mean, but
what's your B2B to B2C distribution? Did you I know you mentioned something, but I didn't get the details.
yeah, it's for us it's about 34 to 36% B2B. But obviously that's like not that's just what we have, not necessarily B2C companies do double the research. All right, so quick demo. All right, cool. So I mentioned we have two products. The first one is doing research with existing users, or sorry, with non-users, so people from our audience. So you come in, you choose if you want to either use consumers or professionals. There'll basically be 3 touch points for you. So the first one is launching a project. So come through, we'll ask you some basic questions about the project. We'll end there. So name, title, description, the number of participants, the length of the study, if it's online or in person or over the phone. We'll ask you different logistical questions about that. If you have a specific location, you can put it in that you want to recruit from, and then any details. And then if you want us to handle distribution, or if you're going to handle distribution of incentives, and then how much the incentives will be. You can then start narrowing down on your audience. So we've got about 20 different just basic structured characteristics you can narrow down on. That's kind of the first pass.
This is the hub, or this is the interviews?
Oh, this is recruit. Should I focus on hub specifically?
No, it's fine. No, as long as it's recruit. Okay, this is a regular one. Yeah.
Well, this is so this is recruit. So this is when you want to get people from our audience.
Yep.
Then what makes us flexible is we have a wide open screener survey. So you can add as many questions as you want. They can be multiple choice, multi-select, short answer, long answer. We have skip logic and multi-pages and stuff if it's more complicated. And then there's qualification criteria. So you can say, hey, they get rejected if they select this one. They must select this answer, different things like that. And then finally, you just put in your schedule. So we link with Google Calendar and Outlook. So you can kind of see your schedule. You can invite collaborators. And then you put in the times that are available. Once that's done, you're done launching the project. Usually it takes about 5 minutes. We'll send out the screener to people we think are likely to qualify based on, once again, all that data we have. They'll start filling out the screener survey. If they select or reject, or don't select a must select, they'll be marked as unqualified. If they pass through it, they'll be marked as qualified. So the second touch point for you is you'll get a screen like this where we'll show you a bunch of people that we found. You can go in, most people are social media verified, so you can go and see their LinkedIn profile or Facebook profile. You can go and click and see how they responded to the questions, their different characteristics. And then really all you need to do here is either approve and invite them or pass on them. Pretty straightforward. Once you approve them, question?
I said swipe left, swipe right.
Swipe left, yeah. We should just do that.
Yeah.
We should make a mobile version.
For your app, yeah.
Yeah, so once you swipe right on somebody, we'll schedule them on the times you told us. And then we'll drop that on your calendar and send you the email once they're scheduled. Obviously, we won't double book. If you want to talk to 5 people but approve 8 people, we'll cut it off once 5 are scheduled. So we handle all of that. We'll send them the information you told us. So if it's in person, kind of the address or any other details you said. If it's remote, whatever link you want them to go to. And you'll also have the ability to message them beforehand to ask them other questions or to give them more information. Once they're scheduled, they show up, complete the study. And once again, we have about a 90-91% show rate as long as it's not March. And then you just come in here and mark people as completed or did not show. If you mark them as completed, we'll send out a payment if we're handling payments at that point. And then that's the basic workflow there. Any questions about there? There's some extra bells and whistles I didn't get into, but that's the basic workflow.
Basil, just wondering about privacy. So I see you have their full name. Is there any way you could filter just so you get their first name and not their last name? Things like that?
We don't have that now. Everyone here has opted in, so they've all given participant consent in our terms and everything to do that. So we're not showing you people that haven't already opted in.
Okay.
But we don't have a way to mask that.
And then kind of a related question, a lot of times we work with clients who kind of have the final say on as far as they want to vet the final list of participants. Is there a way we could download this from a spreadsheet or some kind of Google spreadsheet or whatever? And
yeah, so you can export the data in a CSV, but you can also invite them here. So we have a bunch of collaboration options. So you can invite them as a view only or an edit, where they can actually approve people. In this column I didn't talk about, but that's really used when people are working with colleagues. So you could go through and say, hey, these are my favorites. You can comment on it. So we've built a lot of collaboration into it, but you can also just download a CSV and send it to them.
Cool, thank you.
That
go ahead.
answered one of my questions, but the other question I have is, are you able to do you need a special screener to screen things like location?
So we have basically
rural?
a set of standard questions. So like age, ethnicity, gender, location, what type of computer. We have about 20 of those. So you don't need to add a screener question for those. When you're launching the project here, that's kind of this tab, and you can just pick those. But if something's not there, then you do need to add it as a screener question. So
right, but the location, are you able to distinguish urban and rural?
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant what city they were in or what state they were
in.
We don't have that as one of the standard ones, so I would add that as a screener question.
Okay, but you'd have US and Canada.
Yeah, exactly, or Boston and New York.
Right, okay, thanks.
Cool. I can jump into the other product now if you guys want to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. One other thing with this, there's a new feature we added, which I'm pretty excited about, which is often, researchers want to talk to a similar profile multiple times. So they would launch a project with us. We would find a bunch of people. They would talk to some of them, and then they would go duplicate that project, and we'd go re-recruit. What we've started doing now is basically every time you launch a project with us, we'll actually store everyone we've ever found for you in a CRM-like thing. So then you're kind of constantly building up this panel with us over time. So instead of even having to go through this whole process, you can go, hey, I know I already recruited 10 software engineers. Let me go see if I want to go talk to them. So it makes it even faster. So they're kind of just waiting for you over time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go back here. Let's see. Can you integrate, Peter asked if you could, Peter asked if you can integrate a third-party survey tool like Qualtrics rather than using your survey tool. So that's one thing I didn't make super clear is, so our survey tool is what you have to use for the screening part, so the screener survey. But if, the actual project is an unmoderated task or is a survey itself, then you can send them to Qualtrics. So they start off with our screener, and then you send the people that qualify to Qualtrics to do the actual research session. And you can use us with any, any tool. We're completely agnostic. We don't have product integrations yet. So the way people do that is you'll just kind of copy and paste that link into the details and then send out that link. All right. So if you want to talk to your own participants, like I mentioned, there's kind of 3 interlocking value props. The first is for the end user. So all of the manual tasks that you have to do, the mail merge, scheduling, payments, all of that. So you go here, you click my own users. This should look very similar to what I just showed you. A few differences are you can upload a CSV of your users here, and then you get to write the email, and it can come from your own email address instead of userinterviews.com. But the screener survey, the scheduling is all very much the same. And this part of it looks the same, except obviously you don't have all of the data that we have on everybody because we're not asking them any extra questions. So it's just the data you have. But we keep them walled off. We don't put them into our audience. No one else can see them. It's completely separated for you. The second value prop, this is a terrible demo instance because it's all staging plus number X, but the second value prop is basically the CRM view. So here what you can do is you can upload users to be part of your research hub. When you upload users, you can put any custom columns you want, any data you want on people. You can label them. You can then filter down and cut it and segment it in different ways. So it's database technology with a nice UI on top. But then there's 2 things that make it very specific for user research. So one is you can invite people directly to a study. So you can say, hey, I want to talk to these people, invite them directly to a project. You can create a new project or one that exists. So that makes it kind of a closed loop. And then I mentioned you can upload any columns you want, which you can, but we will always have a few columns here that we calculate. So we'll always calculate when someone was last invited, when they last applied, when they last participated, how many incentives they've earned, and if they've unsubscribed. And what that lets you do is build rules to say, hey, we don't want to reach out to our own users more than once every, call it 90 days. So we'll make sure to track that on the back end, make sure you don't do that. Or, hey, I want to talk to like my churned users. You can have them all labeled. Or in the US, if you pay someone over $600 a year, you have to like distribute a W-9 form, for, like a tax form for them. So now you can cut and see who falls into that and make sure you don't let people go over that threshold. And then the final value prop is an opt-in form. So if you want to find a way to like build up an audience over time, what we do is allow you to make an opt-in form. So you can brand this, so you can put in your logo and change the coloring and add any kind of screener questions you want here. And what this does is it allows you to put this link in different places, send it out in emails, and get people to opt into becoming your research participants. And you can build up your own audience over time. And everything they fill out on these opt-in forms will then kind of wrap back around to the research hub view as custom columns, which you can then once again go down and filter down and invite them to projects. Cool. So I think I just talked to everybody for like 10 minutes straight. Did that make sense? I think the research hub product is probably a little bit more complicated than the earlier product, but any questions about that?
So Basil, the research hub is like if you want to keep your own like internal
It's 20 hours.
users, where the other one is like, it's like your database of just people. Is that
Exactly right? So I think sometimes researchers want us to go find people for them, and then sometimes they already have their list of users. They already know who they want to talk to, but it's still, there's a lot of pain around the logistics and then also the tracking on the back end. So that's
Right.
what research.
Okay.
So do you track things like how many times you've reached out to the person for a particular study, like if they haven't gotten back to you, or is that just all automated?
So we don't, I'm trying to, I mean, I don't know if we do track it. I'm not sure. I don't think we show it to you anywhere specifically. So we do the number of studies in general, but within a specific study, we'll let you know who you've reached out to, but I don't think we show you like if you ping them multiple times, but that's kind of up to you. So we'll only ping them one time, and then you can say, hey, you know, do it another time if you haven't got the response you want. But we try to, with this product, give you a lot more control, and we do a lot less in like the background automations, just because different people want to interact with their own users in very different ways. So we want to make sure that we're not, you know, pinging someone 3 times when that goes against kind of your guidelines internally.
I was in a demo recently where somebody was doing this kind of app equivalent database with Airtable. I mean, you could do this, but it's just a lot of work, and you guys have already thought through all the details. So I think it's really nice solution for people who just, you know, are tired of all those spreadsheets. And he's not paying me for this. We could talk about it later.
Yeah, we find a lot of people. So we find this product tends to be much more valuable for bigger teams because the coordinations becomes a lot more of a problem. Like when you're making sure you're not reaching out to the same person too often. But we find a lot of people just kind of doing this in huge Google Sheets right now. So you have this, you know, the first project, you kind of put up 50 people, then second one's another 50, 60. And there's a lot of kind of VLOOKUPs and people not filling in the cells correctly. So this kind of solves for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the bringing together the panel from many different recruiting avenues. That's the hard thing to coordinate right now.
Yeah, no, we, yeah, that's what we've seen, and definitely across our different clients.
Yeah, great. Are there any more questions?
Thanks, this is great.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that's right.
Well, thanks everyone for listening to me and looking at the product. If you guys are interested in that, I can share my email and give you guys some free trials and stuff. But if you're not interested, don't worry, no pressure there, but I'll send out something afterwards with some links for free trials.
You can put it in the chat if you want.
Can.
Put your contact in the chat, and that way people can take it.